This video will just show a few of the tools that are in ExactFlat, and in this case I have um, a backpack or a rucksack or a bag, I guess, that was created, and we'll just go through and just show some of the tools. So the ExactFlat tools go from left to right, and we have meshing tools up here. So if you have a laser scan or a scan or a file that has some odd looking meshing, we can remesh it. In this case, um, I'll show the meshing tool on some of these surfaces. What we would do is simply select adaptive remesh, and we'd select the part that we wanted to remesh, and we'd hit enter in our keyboard. And once we do that, we have our adaptive remesh tools, and we have sew tolerance, and basically it'll explain how many vertices that we want on each. So right now, uh, this vertex count is almost 5,000 vertices, and there's 5 meshes that make up this bag. That's what these numbers here tell us. So I'm going to just say that's fine. Let's just see what we can do, what kind of a result we'll get when we adaptively remesh. So it's going to go through here. It's just saying that there's a high vertex count, but what it does, as you can see, is relatively quickly, I'll just hit OK here, it creates a mesh that has uh, the polygons are much more structured and are evenly um, dispersed throughout the piece. So if I shade it, we'll be able to see it still retains the same shape. It's just that we've taken the polygons and we've spread them across the part equally, and that helps in the flattening process. One thing I'd like to show also is in our tools right here, uh, where you open up the ExactFlat dialog box, so our sprocket here, we can actually go into localization, and I can select English, Spanish, French, German, or Italian here. So I speak English, I'm just going to leave it on English, but it will localize to whatever language you'd like out of those 5. Also what we have here in settings is basically where we create our seam allowance. In this case I have 1/2 inch or 1/2 unit. Basically gives our spring types, and these are all default settings. So you can go in and you can say, well, I don't want a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Maybe I want a 1/4 inch instead of 1/2 inch, or our text size. I'm going to leave it at 1/2 inch so you can see what the seams look like. I'll just hit OK here. So the next tool after I've adaptively remeshed, so I've gone from a meshing tools, or from a meshing tools just into my regular tools, and we go from left to right. So the first button here is select a piece for flattening. So I can go in and I can select surfaces that I want flattened, or I can just rectangle select everything and say flatten everything. In this case I'm going to say flatten everything. So just hit that and then hit enter on my keyboard. Now I'll go into my layers. This is my layer state here, and I'm just going to double click and highlight the pattern, and I'm going to turn off the other layers here because I'm not, and I'll go from perspective into a top view, and I'm going to basically bring all these pattern pieces in view. So we have our 5 pattern pieces, and right here this is what they call flip triangles. And what that means is the material is actually flipped over on itself. So this is our initial 2D flat pattern. I'm just going to kind of spread it out a little bit over here. And if I go on my strain analysis, I go into shaded view, it's going to show the strain on the parts. Again, if I go into my options tool, I can go into the legend, and it'll show the different stress factors. So red, this red here, is above 20% strain on the material, or stress on the material. Yellow is 15, 10% for green, 5% is cyan, and white is no stress. So ExactFlat for Rhino is a 2-step flattener. The first step basically gives us this flat, projected flat pattern, but it's not an optimized pattern. We still have work to do. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to use a function called pelt, this tool here, and I'll select the piece, and it's going to get rid of those flip triangles. And I'll do it to this piece, and I'll do it to this piece, and I'll do it to this piece, and I'll do it to this piece. Anyway, so the pelt can get rid of when we have a bunch of flip triangles like I just showed you. It can get rid of those. Just going to move these pieces around. We're still not at a flat pattern, and this looks kind of not good. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to do an optimize. So I click this spring button, and I'll just select the pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and hit enter on my keyboard. And this brings up our spring settings. And this is where I can select a material, because a lot of people ask about, can we select materials? So I can go into my library, my material library, and select a material. Now, this material right here is a rubberized material that's used for making Zodiac boats. And we have cotton, we have different wools and denims, and there's quite a few different materials here. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to use the, I'll use this material for Zodiac boats. I'll hit OK here. Then I'm going to hit OK here, and we'll start seeing these patterns change. In fact, I'll just click this here. That brings up this dialog box, and in a second, you'll see that these pieces will start flattening. And if you look closely, you'll notice, especially with this piece, you can see how it's changing. So what ExactFlat does is basically try to get zero energy across that pattern piece based on the material that we've selected, in this case a rubberized material. So it's going through, and because I selected that material, it's going to take a little bit longer than if I had selected cotton, for instance. This just gives us here a status, and we can export out a report that would give us all the different tolerances and all this information should we be interested in that. Okay, so now that we have the pattern pieces fixed or flattened, I just hit OK, and here's our flattened pattern pieces. Some of the other tools that ExactFlat for Rhino has would be a find tool, which is this binocular here, and I can just place it over a piece and it'll align the pieces that go together. And so that's basically kind of walking the pattern. If I go over here, I'll show you a little bit better how the pattern can be walked. So I can just select an edge here, and you can see it'll find how the pattern goes. Oh, just put this back. Another tool that we have in ExactFlat is a notching tool. So ExactFlat for Rhino, we can go here, open our dialog box for notching, and I can just add a notch here and a notch here. And as you see, as I add notches, they automatically pair with the piece that it gets notched to. So there's no more guessing where we have to sew pieces together. They're notched, and just close that. We can also tag pieces. So I can add a notch tag, say here, it shows up as a triangle or a diamond shape, and just close that. The other tool that we have is, as I said, we have a material editor, so we can go and we can change materials on the pattern pieces. We can add grain lines to a pattern piece. We can trace a piece. So if we have a something that we want traced from the 3D model, we can trace that using a trace tool in ExactFlat for Rhino. Once we've done this, basically there's other tools here such as cutting tools. We have a plane cutter, so you can select an edge here and an edge here, and we can cut the mesh. So again, just select a piece here and a piece here, and select the mesh and cut it. So that's cut, and then basically we can rejoin it just by selecting this and manually rejoining the piece. Once that's done, we can export the piece out as a DXF. So I'm just going to bring all these pieces in, and I'll use my find tool, and we'll place all the pieces together again. And just move it out a little bit, because I'm going to add a 1/2 inch seam. And what we would do is use our export tool here and export out the piece. And I'll just call this a test. So it's a test DXF. If I go in to open the file and go into my desktop, and we'll just find test DXF. And this is in inches, so I just hit OK. Now let's go here to our view. So basically you can see it's added the notches. I have actually created a naming convention. So it has the notch tags, and it has our perimeter piece and our seam. And if I go into my layers over here, I can see that we have a grain line, a cut line, a notch, a seam, a piece tag, and a notch tag. So I can turn off these layers, and you can see basically, so I just turned off the names, but you can go through and you have a file that can be cut by a cutter quite easily. I hope this answers questions that people have had, and if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call.